Good evening, welcome, and let's bow in prayer. Our great Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us the chance to come together tonight. Lord, the nights are cold these days and dark, but we still love you enough to come together and study your word together and to sing some songs of praise. And God, we thank you that you have given us both the help and the devotion to do so. Help us, Lord, to continue to grow in our devotion and in our knowledge and in our willingness to do whatever it takes to serve you and to serve you well. Help us, Lord, to remember that as we serve you, we can do so quietly in privacy and kind of hold the gospel and the truth to ourselves, or, Lord, we can serve you in a way that helps us to grow influence in the world around us so that we might bring people to your kingdom, so that we might show them the goodness of your Son and the sacrifice he gave for us, and so that we might give them hope, the same hope that we enjoy. Lord, help us to be those who would so willingly put our own need for privacy and safety aside for the sake of bringing hope and goodness to others. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, go ahead and open those Bibles up to 2 Kings 11. 2 Kings 11. And we'll be covering a few chapters here. Getting fairly close to the end of our story portion of the class before we jump into the prophet. But we will be continuing on here with the story. We're going to switch back and forth quite a bit tonight in tonight's class between Israel and Judah, because there's quite a bit of switching around in this section. We covered the story of Jehu on Sunday, and of course Amaziah also, and we're going to talk a little more about Athelia tonight, but kind of carry the story of Judah forward, and we'll come back to this little chart in a moment. Athelia is the one and only queen of Judah. There's been queens of Judah, but she's the only ruling queen, I believe, that we have during the story. And she's not a great woman. We know a little bit about her. We know that her husband was king. He died. Her son became king. He died. And so when all that happened, she wasn't ready to leave that nice cushy palace there in Jerusalem, so she decided she'd just become queen herself, and so badly wanted that job that what does she do? Kills all her children. Wonderful. That's what every good mother wants to do, right? So not known for her mothering skills. That's one thing that we know. She goes and her children end up dying, except for one, which depending on the passage you're looking at, and again, this is part of what makes it all so confusing. In some passages, he is called Jehoash. We typically, in our timeline, just take the shorter version of that and trying to use this as a glasses cleaner, and it doesn't work real good. It's just kind of awkward here, but excuse me for a second. All right, much better. So he's called Jehoash. I think I'm good, but as greasy as my face is, I might need it before the end of class. So Jehoash, and then we tend to shorten that down to Joash. I'm going to put Jehoash in here, mostly because that's what my version calls him, at least in 2 Kings. When you get into Chronicles, he is called Joash, but I will call him Jehoash, and I'll try to be clear about whether we're speaking of the Judah Jehoash or the Israel Jehoash, because there's one of those, and we've got repeated names again, and of course that makes everything confusing. Jehosheba, who is Jehoash's aunt, she decides that she is going to save Jehoash. She rescues him from the murderous plot of Queen Athelia, and she gives him to the priest Jehoiada. Now, what I find interesting about that is I've always wondered how Queen Athelia missed one. Like you would think, okay, I'm going to kill all my children, but one of them has gone missing and he's little, you're going to hunt the child down. Wouldn't you think that? I mean, I'm following along this like it's a good movie, and that you think you would be thorough enough to actually kill all the kids if you were going to kill all the kids. But somehow Jehoash gets overlooked, okay? Now again, he gets rescued, I understand that, and they hide him. But do they hide him in an out-of-the-way, out in the country, little closet basement room that's hidden and nobody knows that room exists? Where is he hidden? In Jerusalem, my understanding is he's hidden kind of where anybody should be able to find this fellow. This is not a very thorough lady, is what I'm finding out. So he ends up being hidden there, and so that again, it's just kind of interesting. He gets hidden, and it seems that he's hidden but he's hidden in the house of the Lord, if I'm remembering my story correctly. So I mean, it's not like this is an unknown location. He's hidden in probably one of the most prominent buildings in all of town, which means one of two things. It's possible one reason he's able to hide so well is that nobody's really going to the house of the Lord. So that is an out-of-the-way place at this point. There's just not a well-visited place. I would dare say it is at least not a place Queen Athelia visits very often, right? Like this is not her go-to weekend spot. That she's not that kind of lady. She's not there for worship periods and such. And so they're able to hide him there in the temple. After several years, you've got this whole story that much greater detail is given over in the Chronicles, but you've got this story of how Jehoiada comes and brings in prominent men from different tribes, and he brings them in, and they concoct a plan, really, of a temple guard that is going to guard him. They're going to guard him right there in the house of the Lord, and they will eventually, fairly quickly it seems in the story, set him on the throne and establish him as the new king. And again, there's part of me that completely gets this after going through as many stories as we've gone through where they have not kept the rules of the way you're supposed to treat the temple. I don't know why it still shocks me a little bit when I see people in the temple that really shouldn't be in the temple, right? But I mean, that's kind of what you have going on here. Not just the priest and the Levites would come and they would take their turn, their shifts in protecting Jehoash, but you also have, people seemingly there that shouldn't be there in the house of the Lord. But I think that's one reason they're there. Where else are you going to get to go where there's not going to be any spies, right? Go to the place where nobody's allowed to go. And so Jehoiada brings them in there, and they're able to hide from Queen Athelia. Well, they end up setting Jehoash on the throne. How old is he? 7-year-old king. So not only is Queen Athelia a horrible mother, and she's a horrible, just horrible all around, she's apparently so bad of a queen that a 7-year-old little boy is a better king than she is queen. Like that's about as insulting as it gets when you really look at the transfer of power here. But Jehoiada goes, and he is seemingly an extraordinary man. He is very much one of the brightest spots in the whole divided kingdom story. We give Joash or Jehoash the smiley face a lot of times. Who really deserves the smiley face? Jehoiada. Like he really is the bright spot in the story. He is the one who is involved in this protecting of Jehoash. He is the one who concocts the plan in order to get people there, in order to make him king and to put a 7-year-old on the throne. He is the continual advisor to Jehoash for many, many years. He is the one who plans the killing of Baal's priest. He tears down the altars for Baal. They put Athelia to death as a result of all of this. He really kind of just cleans things up. Like, he makes this whole plan for how they're going to put a 7-year-old on the throne, get rid of Baal, get rid of the queen. And they do it. And it seems as if they do it well enough that there aren't really any hiccups in the plan. Like, you don't read of anything going wrong. It just all works. And Jehoiada is the one who is able to make that happen. So he's only 7 years old, and I love what it says here. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord all his days, and I wish the sentence ended there, don't you? Like, that's where I wish we could just go, woo, smiley face, put him on the timeline. Like, that's good. But it adds this little section on the end in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So as long as Jehoiada was around, he did great. He was a great king. He was a king who feared God. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. But then you have this next sentence, only the high places were not taken down. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of having this yay, oh, you know, that's kind of the reaction you get with all of these kings. Like, we're finally good. No, he didn't quite get the job done. And you see that again here with Jehoash. He seems to do good. Now, and this again takes me back to what we said about Jehu. Isn't this exactly what it says about Jehu? Jehu did what was right. God was pleased with Jehu. Jehu did good things. He did exactly what the Lord said. He talked about his zeal for the Lord, but right at the end but he didn't take down the high places and the 2 golden calves. Okay, so it's one of those, you know, I have a hard time not seeing Jehu at least as good as I see Joash or Jehoash. But I also don't see Jehoash as any better than I see Jehu. You know, they're kind of equal in my mind. So I wish we'd redo our timelines a little bit. Maybe put instead of a smiley face or a frowny face, we could just put a flat line, you know, straight mouth face. Wouldn't that be better? You know. So this is Jehoash to me is a straight line face, not smiley, not frowny, just neutral. So, but he's better than Queen Athelia, so that's good. I also find it interesting that as we go through the good kings of Judah, so one of the things I do when I study the Bible is I always look for patterns. I always look for, you know, especially when you've got long series of stories, oftentimes there is a pattern to the story that helps you realize what's being said. Now, you look back at the book of Judges, and you've got a pattern to the book of Judges, right? 2 main patterns. One is the cycle of sin that we talk about, where, you know, they turn away from God. God brings them into oppression. They cry out to God. God sends a deliverer. They turn back to God. And then we go through the pattern again. They turn away from God. God sends an oppressor. You know, you've got this pattern. Well, what's interesting in the judges' pattern is every judge that we get is a little bit worse than the last judge, to the point to where you go from Othniel, woohoo, great guy, to Samson, oh, that's awful, right? Like you have this decreasing faithfulness. What's odd to me about the story of the divided kingdom, particularly in Judah, is that there does not seem to really be a decline, at least at this point of the story. every king that is good is described in pretty much exactly the same way. Are they not? They did good, but they didn't take down the high places. They did good, but they didn't take down the high. Like you have the same pattern where you read the story of one of the good kings and you're like, yes, finally, we're back to serving God. And then you have that little caveat at the end that makes you go, oh, apparently we're not back to serving God. Okay? And that what could be the lesson behind that? What do you think? Okay? I think you definitely see some stuff about God's character here, especially like he said, God is patient. You know, they keep doing the same thing over and over again, and yet God still continues. You know, how many times, even in today's reading, did you have it say things like, God still relented because of David, or God still relented because of, you know, there was good. And so you see that patience of God, that I like the term long-suffering of God through the history of these people. Chris? Yeah. 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 Well, that's one thing I love about Jehoiada. You know, here's Jehoiada, good or bad guy. Incredible. Who's queen? Athelia. Here's an incredible servant of the Lord, serving even in the temple, which apparently not a lot of people are coming to these days, yet still serving the way he's supposed to serve, loving God, doing things for God, despite the ruler. Despite the fact that I'm sure he does not have the support of the queen or the support of the royalty in Judah. So absolutely that is true. I'll tell you, I think one of the other lessons you have in this particular part of the story is not even just the long-suffering of God. This kind of goes hand in hand with that. But the idea of nothing's going to change. Okay? That it justifies the punishment that God brings to the people in captivity. That, you know, God continually offered opportunities for them to change. Absolutely with Judah. What about Israel? Absolutely. I mean, the whole story of Elijah, Elisha, the evidence that was given to Ahab, the excellent work of Jehu. You see opportunity after opportunity given to Israel to turn it around and go back to God. Do they? They don't. It's the same old, same old. Doesn't matter how great the evidence is. It doesn't matter how good the ruler is. They still continue in their sin. So God is justified in bringing them to captivity. Make sense? And I think you see the same thing with Judah, a justification for the captivity that's going to come. They're not changing their ways. Even when they get a good king, like what we just read there, Jehoash or Joash was a good king for the whole time Jehoiada was alive. But the people still sacrificed to the idols. They still burned incense on the high places. So even when we have a great high priest and seemingly a great king, a kind of nurtured king, because he's walking step by step with Jehoiada, still the people burned incense and they sacrificed on the high places. So it allows us to see more justification for what's still to come. So keep that in the back of your head as we continue through these stories. You also have this great story here, and I know this text I tried to make the text bigger, and then I apparently added more text. But Jehoash wanted to repair the temple. That was a passionate, like a passion project for him. And so it's interesting, he basically commands that the priest gather the money that the people are going to bring in, that is brought in for the care of the temple, and use the money for the care of the temple. Like, do the job, get in there, get this job done. After 23 years of sitting on the throne, they still hadn't fixed the temple, like a project around my house. So, I mean, it just left undone. And it's interesting when you get over into 2 Chronicles, it's Jehoiada who's not getting it done. I don't know if he just wasn't a fixer-upper guy, what the problem was. But here, I mean, Jehoiada clearly loves the Lord. He clearly follows the Lord and obeys the Lord. But Jehoash has said, I want this job done, and it's not getting done. So at 23 years, his 23rd year on the throne, which is coincidentally the same time there's a change in leadership up in Israel, which we'll come back and talk about in a moment, Jehoash basically says, okay, enough waiting, let's get the job done. And so he basically says, what do we got to do? They set up basically he fired them. He says, y'all aren't going to do the job, then I'll come up and do the job. And so he put up a chest with a hole in the top, kind of a collection box as we would think of it. And the people, that's where they were to gather together their money, their collection. They bring it into the temple, and then he would oversee the repairs himself. He kind of takes a hands-on approach here, for lack of a better term. Why do you think he has to do it this way? My assumption is this, and this is an assumption, so I preface it with that. We're not really told, but it is interesting to me that that money, have the people been giving the money? Where's it going? We're never told that. But it's interesting to me that the solution is, let's put it in a chest where nobody can get to it, and then we'll have the money to get the project done. It seems to me, and this is my assumption, that for 23 years they've been wasting this money on stuff that it's not supposed to be used on. And basically, Jehoash comes in and says, all right, let's collect this money in a way nobody can pilfer it, and then we're going to go and get this job done. And he does. As soon as they start bringing the money in, they start using it to make the repairs. You have a little bit after this story, Jehoiada dies. He's 130 when he dies, which is not common. That's older than Moses was when Moses died at 120. I mean, that is, the average age at this point is, I mean, he's more than doubled the average age of what people would typically live back in this time. So he ate right, I guess, or God preserved him. We're not really told why he lives that long, other than I think probably God knew he had was serving a purpose. But I do find it interesting that it brings up that when he dies, he gets buried with the kings. Okay, he's not buried where, like his family plot. He's not buried over where typically people would be buried. He's buried with the kings. And I think that's interesting because it's very clear as to why he's buried with the king. You get over to verse 7, chapter 2 Chronicles 24, verse 15. Jehoiada died when he was old, full of days. He was 130 years old when he at his death. He was buried in the city of David with the king because he had done what was good in Israel with respect to God and his temple. So he gets buried with the kings because he's a man who loves God, respects God, serves God, served God's temple well. He did the job God had called him to do, and he was honored because of it. And I find that to be remarkable in the story, because there's not a lot of those people through this portion of history. Jehoash is not faithful, and so you've got this story where we're told that he ends up killing Zechariah. Okay, who is Zechariah? Jehoiada's son. What do we know about Zechariah? What do we know about him? Okay, so he rebuked Jehoash. So he is, and the Judah Jehoash, not this Jehoash, the one who was, I would guess, treated like one of the family. I mean, Zechariah is one of Jehoiada's sons. Here, Jehoash has been very involved in Jehoiada's life. But it says over in 2 Chronicles 24, the Spirit of the Lord enveloped Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood above the people and said to them, "This is what God says. Why are you transgressing the Lord's command so that you do not prosper? Because you have abandoned the Lord, he has abandoned you." But they conspire against him and stoned him at the king's command in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. That's just harsh. Like, they didn't even, he commands them, go stone him. Okay? Now they are not pleased with that. They're not pleased with the way all of that happened. It's interesting also, Jehoiada, while he was dying, he said, "May the Lord see and demand an account," which ends up happening. Jehoash ends up getting killed himself because of the way he has treated Zechariah. So, again, you've got bad things going on. Hazael, who we've heard of already, he's the king of Aram. He comes in order to attack. Jehoash, instead of trusting in the Lord, basically empties out the coffers and sends all of these treasures to Hazael as a tribute to try to prevent the war, not the actions of a man who's trusting in God in this portion of the story. And so some servants end up conspiring against Jehoash, and they kill him, but they kill him mostly because of what happened with Zechariah. Like they're so upset about the way that was handled that Jehoash loses all credibility. So, and again, you can understand why. Here, he kills the man who showed him kindness and saved his life, killed his family. Like that's just ungrateful. And not because he did anything wrong. He prophesied for the Lord, and he got killed for it. And so that's just a sad story, a sad piece of this whole deal. So that's where Judah's at this point. Let's run back up to Israel, because maybe things are good in Israel. They're not going to be good in Israel. It's going to go downhill real fast after Jehu. Jehoahaz, who's the son of Jehu, he ends up becoming the king of Israel. He's evil. God allows him to also be oppressed by Aram. So while Hazael is attacking Judah, he's also attacking Israel. He has more luck in Israel than he does in Judah, because Judah pays him off. Not yet. Jehoahaz does cry to the Lord, but God delivers him. But because he continues to do evil, God ends up letting him be oppressed again, and it's just one of those. Again, God's trying to give evidence and a little bit of hope, and hey, I'll help you if you serve me, and hey, you're crying out to me. Look, I can help you. I can serve. I can protect you. But does it ever do any good? Not in Israel. It doesn't do any good. And so that's again, I think, one of those points that we keep coming back to in this story. Then his son Jehoash becomes king. So if this weren't confusing already, now it's going to be even more confusing. But Jehoash in Israel is also evil, and so things just go bad. So again, we've got this timeline. We've already had two Ahaziahs on both sides of the line of the border. You've got Jehoash and Joash, which are really the same name. They're on both sides of the border, and so you just see the way that tends to work. I also think anytime you see the parallel names between the north and the south, that there probably was some sort of relationship that caused that to happen. We know that with Ahaziah, they were family, and so it makes sense that they would share names. But even Jehoash and Jehoash, I think probably the second, Jehoahaz is king of Israel while Jehoash is king of Judah, and then he names his son Jehoash. So, I don't think that's far-fetched to think there's a connection there, a friendship, a family, or some sort of connection there between these two very close kingdoms. But again, that I think is where you see things start to fall apart. Then we have the story of Elisha dying. Jehoash, the king of Israel, not the king of Judah, the king of Israel goes to visit Elisha. And it's funny, he goes to visit Elisha, and Elisha, it seems not in order to get answers per se, but that's exactly what Elisha does. That Elisha basically says, okay, well, just understand you're gonna have victory. And I'm not even sure there's even an understanding that there's a battle going on. But that's the way it happens. So we're over here in chapter 13, 2 Kings 13. Elisha becomes sick. King Jehoash of Israel went down, wept over him, and said, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Why do you think he says that? Okay, yeah. If you remember when Elisha witnessed the ascension of Elijah, there's a lot of people that call it the translation. Have y'all ever heard that? So that's what people will call it sometimes in writings of when Elijah was taken to heaven, he was translated from one form to another. And so they call it the translation of Elijah. I just think that's an interesting little picture of what happened there. So when Elisha witnessed Elijah being translated up into heaven, he makes this same statement: my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And why did Elisha say that? Do what? Okay, so in that case, you've got Elisha seeing very vividly the fiery horse and chariot that separated him from Elijah. If you look back in, this is 2 Kings chapter 2. 2 Kings chapter 2. Elijah is trying to ditch Elisha. Elisha's hanging on. Elijah tries to ditch him again. Elisha hangs on. So basically, Elijah says, tell me what you can do. Verse 11, as they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the two of them. Then Elijah went up into heaven in a whirlwind. As Elisha watched, he kept crying out, my father, the chariot and horsemen of Israel. I'll be honest, I don't really know. I've not been able to find anything that says this is an idiom that means this particular idea or anything like that. So that phrase itself, it baffles me a little bit. And again, it made sense in chapter 2 because Elisha had literally seen a chariot and a horse from God. Like that was it made sense. But when you're over here in chapter 13 and you've got a king saying that to Elisha, when there is no visible horse and chariot of fire, it's a little more baffling, I think. Nancy? Yeah, maybe so. I really, that is one direction my brain took on it, that maybe this is just a kind of an honorary way of saying, just like you sent off Elijah, I'm going to send you off in the same way. I wondered if that's the case, if there's not also a kind of a desire of, hey, give me some of those powers that Elijah gave you. Like how much of the story is he trying to parallel here? I don't know, because it's not really explained. It's just kind of an odd statement that's made. I have also wondered, because of Elisha's response, which is what? What's Elisha immediately say? Yeah, grab a bow, shoot it, and then he prophesies victory, right? So I've wondered if maybe in some way this is a question of, that's why Elisha has the response he does, is that maybe this is a way of saying, hey, is God on our side? Do you see the horses and chariots of Israel? Is this, is God going to defend us in this battle? So maybe it's intended that way. I don't know. If it is, it's odd that he words verbatim what Elisha said to Elijah at Elijah's translation. And so I tell you, I don't know what the answer is. Sometimes I just want to throw the questions out there to see if maybe y'all can help me out. But it is an odd send-off, I guess. Keith? Okay. Okay. But it could be. It's a kind of a statement of praise toward Elisha for his strength and his representing of God, and maybe so. And that's why Elisha would say that to Elijah, and the same sort of mourning of, hey, we're losing the strength of God, and that kind of praise. Chris? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, maybe so. It is interesting how often chariots of fire show up in Elisha's life, isn't it? So at Elijah's translation with the servant and his lack of faith here in this statement, it's interesting. I don't know what the real answer is. This, one of the 400,000 questions I still have unanswered about the Bible, and why I keep studying, day after day, week after week. If I can get that down to 390,000, I'll be thrilled. But we'll go from there. But go ahead, Rick. Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's also interesting to me that, and again, we only have bits and pieces of the story, how often they come to Elijah, Elisha, Micaiah, all of these prophets, recognizing these men really do have the answer because their answer comes from Jehovah. If you know that, why wouldn't you always go to them? Like, why would you split your time between them and these other guys over here who don't seem to ever have the answer? Except in the case of Ahab, because they gave him the answer he wanted, which was, he was very blunt about that. But they clearly recognize God's power and knowledge, but they don't always turn to it. Elisha basically says, shoot that bow. he does. He says, that's what's going to happen with you. You're going to have victory. Then he tells them to bang the bow on the ground. He bangs the bow 3 times, and Elisha goes, you idiot, you should have banged it 5 or 6 times, and then you would have completely demolished them. But now you're only going to beat them 3 times, and that's it. So not sure how he should have known. He should have gone 6 times instead of 3, it is what it is. So he ends up having those 3 victories against Aram, and so Jehoash is able to gain some success from God, but ultimately Jehoash from Israel is evil and does not gain complete victory. Meanwhile, back down in Judah, we've had Jehoash has been killed by his servant, so his son Amaziah becomes king. He did right, but not completely. Have we heard that before? the repeated theme of the king. He gained vengeance on those who killed his father. And I find it interesting when you look at the story, while he does get vengeance on them and makes things right, in that case, he does not go too far. It's interesting when he talks about the reason this is chapter 14 of 2 Kings, verse 6. However, he did not put the children of the killers to death, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers are not to be put to death because of their children, and children are not to be put to death because of fathers. Instead, each one will be put to death for his own sin. So why did he refrain from just having a full-out slaughter on the family of these killers? Because he was honoring the law of the Lord. And so, you read little things like that, and you're like, yay! Like, that's the way this is supposed to work. But, of course, he doesn't do it completely. Amaziah does win a war against Israel. He, for whatever reason, thinks that's a good idea. Interestingly, when he does that, Jehoash of Israel says, you're going to regret it. And he goes to battle against him, and he regrets it. It's interesting that God doesn't honor him. And I find that interesting because Jehoash of Israel, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Bad. Amaziah of Judah, good guy or bad guy? We'll just say a straight-mouthed guy. Like he's not frowny faced. Like he does better than Jehoash of Israel. So in our expectation of the way this should go, who should win this battle? Amaziah. But he doesn't, because it's not God's purpose. And so it is interesting to see, even here there are some difficulties. So Jehoash from Israel comes, they defeat Amaziah, they capture Amaziah, they end up destroying the walls of Jerusalem, they take the utensils out of the house of God, so clearly they don't have a respect for the house of God and the things that are in the house of God. So it's shocking, I think, for us to look at this and go, why in the world would God give victory to the bad one and not give victory to the okay one? I won't say good, but okay one. And again, the only answer I really have is God has his own plan. God's doing this the way God knows it needs to happen. And then the people end up conspiring against Amaziah, and they kill him over in Lachish. I want you to note something. The last 3 kings of Judah have been assassinated. That's a big turnaround from earlier in Judah's history. Right? Earlier in Judah's history, they all died of old age. They all kind of lived out their reign and then died and their son took over. All of the sudden, in this sequence of kings, things have gotten a bit more violent. Okay? I do think things are staying steady regarding the faithfulness of Israel. You don't necessarily have a downward spiral. We're going to still have a few bright moments in the future, like Hezekiah. But there are some things changing. Now we're having kings being assassinated, which that has always been Israel's history. From the very first kings of Israel, kings are getting assassinated. But here in Judah, you've got all of a sudden that's what's happening. Azariah, or also known as Uzziah, becomes king. The people kind of put him in place of his father. He built Elath, and that's about all we know about him. There's just not a lot said, as far as I could tell through the story. Up in Israel, though, we've got a new king named Jeroboam, which, again, should be a precursor to how good of a king he's going to be, right? You know, when you name him after one of the evil kings, then he's probably going to be an evil king. He's evil. He restores the borders of Israel. So as Judah's getting weaker, now we've got Israel getting stronger as a country. And that was exactly what Jonah the prophet was going to say. This is probably the same Jonah the prophet, which gives us a good timeline as to when Jonah did his prophecy. God rescued the people through Jeroboam because of God's compassion. I don't want you to misunderstand my his there. Not Jeroboam's compassion, but because of God's compassion. And again, I want you to see that real quick. That's over here in chapter 14 again. Verse 26. Somebody read 26 and 27 for me. All right. So, you know, things are bad. People are enslaved. Things aren't going well for anybody. But God is compassionate enough to rescue them again, kind of help them out and keep them safe. And so not because of the king at this point. At this point, the people don't deserve it. The king doesn't deserve it. But God's going to do what God's going to do because God is a compassionate and kind God. So you go back to what Keith said earlier. A lot of these stories are teaching us about God's character as much as anything else. And I don't want us to lose sight of that. Back down in Judah, I told you we'd switch back and forth a lot today. Back down in Judah, Azariah becomes king. He did what was right, but the high places were not taken away. Have we heard this before? Every single time we got a good king, we got the statement that the high places were not taken away. And because of that, God ends up making him a leper. He ends up having to live in a separate house. Jotham ends up acting as king, his son, and kind of carrying on the business while Azariah was kind of a king at a distance. He was king in seclusion. And so that's just kind of, it reminds me of, if anybody's seen Braveheart, you got that king with leprosy and his son sits on the throne, and this same kind of scenario here. So that's the scene that pops into my head, wearing animal skins and all that kind of stuff. So Keith. For it. Did I skip one? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's called both. So again, that makes it confusing. Why not give everybody the two names and the same names? So okay, yeah, Uzziah's disease, infant. Yep, the Lord afflicted him. King Uzziah was diseased to the time of his death, which again is kind of interesting that you've got Azariah disease, you got Uzziah disease. Let me go back to, so here's where I had, Azariah. So, I just put it all on a separate screen. That's what I did there. So where we're at on the timeline, just to kind of give you an idea, you got Azariah here. Notice he kind of has a co-regency here with Jotham because of his leprosy. And you've got Jeroboam here, and so that kind of gives you an idea of where we're at. And we're getting pretty close to the Assyrian captivity here, which is when we're going to move on to talking about some of those prophets here. So reading for next class, 2 Kings 15, all the way through the end of 17, and then a couple of chapters in 2 Chronicles. So make sure you grab those extra chapters.